A sudden gut-wrenching silence fell over the penthouse. One moment, the room was a stage for a furious argument between a powerful man and his pregnant wife. The next, it was shattered by a sound that no one ever imagined they would hear. A swift, brutal crack of wood striking flesh, followed by a scream that was more of a choked sob than a cry for help. The man, a celebrated CEO named David, stood over his wife, Sarah, a decorative walking stick in his hand. His face, normally a mask of calm success, was twisted with a rage that seemed to burn from within. In his mind, he was in control, a master of his domain. But he was utterly blind to the fact that every single blow was being etched into the memory of someone who would never, ever forgive him. Sarah's brother, Michael, was already gathering an ironclad case against him. And in a single, terrible moment, everything the magnate had spent years building was about to crumble like a sandcastle before a rising tide. Just a few days earlier, the church bells in Boston had rung out across the city. Beacon Hill was alive with the glow of streetlights and the distant sound of live jazz music floating from the streets. In the midst of the festival's joy, the apparent calm of one family hid invisible cracks. Sarah walked with her husband, David, her hand resting protectively on her swollen stomach. She smiled and greeted neighbors, accepting their well wishes. But she searched his face for a flicker of simple affection that wasn't there. David responded with polite nods, but his eyes constantly darted toward his watch, as if his mind were 100 miles away. The city celebrated, and Sarah longed to celebrate too. But a quiet dread had settled in her soul. She hoped a simple conversation could chase away the unease, but he just seemed to want to get this over with and leave as soon as possible. They decided to find a quiet corner at a cafe. Sarah ordered a latte and a glass of water, while David chose wine. The waiter smiled and walked away. Sarah seized the moment to talk about her upcoming doctor's appointment. She mentioned that the baby was kicking more and more at night, a fact that filled her with such joy. Then she suggested they take a stroll down a side street to avoid the crowds. David said he had an important meeting the next day and needed to get to bed early. She nodded, not insisting, and concentrated on maintaining her composure. She took a slow sip of her coffee, breathing in the steam, and naturally, tenderly, caressed her belly. Then, from a distance, a woman appeared. It was Chloe. She was confident, elegant, and had a smile that she passed out like a gift to everyone she met. She moved gracefully between the tables, leaning in to kiss friends hello, and when she looked up, her eyes found David. The greeting was minimal, a fleeting look, a contained smile, a quick tilt of the head. But it was enough. The entire atmosphere around their table shifted. Sarah felt it instantly. She didn't hear a word, but she recognized the quick, secret understanding between them. A silent flash of a shared world she wasn't a part of. She carefully put her cup down, took another sip, and decided to simply observe David. He returned his gaze to his wine, swirling it slowly. The silence that followed spoke volumes to her. She told herself it was not the time for assumptions. She decided to just finish her drink and suggest they go home, cutting the night short. A kind, older neighbor approached to congratulate her on her pregnancy. Sarah spoke calmly about the doctor, her morning fatigue, and the baby shopping she had already started. The woman took her hand and told her she looked beautiful, that motherhood was glowing on her. The simple kindness sustained her. When the neighbor left, Sarah looked at David. He seemed even more agitated. His eyes lingered on the spot where Chloe had disappeared into the crowd. Sarah suggested they pay the bill and walk a bit. He quickly threw some cash on the tray and stood up. They walked together toward the center of the park. As they moved, Sarah tried to sound lighthearted. She suggested they pick out names for the baby. She even proposed a small dinner with both of their parents to celebrate the end of the festival. He said he had business trips planned for the following month and couldn't promise any dates. She nodded, avoiding an argument. She remembered their first walk through this very park, when everything felt easy and full of promise. Now, she felt a hole that had grown between them, one that words could no longer fill. They ducked into a less crowded street with a storefront, and Sarah saw her reflection in the glass. She recognized the effort it took to hold her head high. Next to her, David walked with his chin up, his gaze lost somewhere else. She took a deep breath and decided to try again, with a soft, humble phrase. She said she was feeling very tired these days, and that a quiet night together would be nice, with no commitments. David just said, "We'll see." The coldness of those two words landed on her heart, with the crushing weight of an answer that would never come. Then, just as the worst of her fear had begun to recede, Chloe reappeared near a group of friends. It was only for a second, but David stiffened visibly. Their eyes held for a moment longer than was polite. Sarah saw it all and chose to remain calm. She placed her hand on David's forearm and said she wanted to sit on a bench for a moment. He impatiently agreed. They sat in silence. Sarah tried to bring up her brother, Michael, mentioning that he always asked about David and wished they would get along better. David replied that he found his brother-in-law to be decent enough, but too demanding. Sarah chose not to argue. The park was still alive. A circle of college students clapped along to a guitarist's rhythm. A grandmother lifted her granddaughter to see the lights. Sarah watched the scene and let a moment of serenity wash over her. She took David's arm again and suggested they go back to the central part of the park to say goodnight to the city. They walked slowly. She tried to convince herself that the distance she felt was just due to exhaustion or the routine of their lives. She wanted to give her husband the benefit of the doubt. She didn't ask for explanations. She held back her questions. As they passed the cafe again, Chloe stopped next to a group of friends. The quick smile she gave David no longer pretended to be a coincidence. He just slightly inclined his head, like someone confirming a signal. Sarah understood without drama. She knew it wasn't the time for a scene or for accusations. She chose to preserve her dignity and her peace. She approached David and told him it was time to leave. He nodded without looking at her. They reached the main arcade, and the clock tower chimed the hour with a clean, clear sound. Sarah felt a shudder that didn't come from the cold wind. It was the intimate certainty that there was something in her husband's life that he didn't share with her. She didn't need proof or explanations. Not tonight. She protectively stroked her belly, thinking of her baby. She promised herself she would take care of them both. She decided not to fall apart in the middle of the park. She held her head high. She took a step, and then another, as if rebuilding herself from the core. David walked beside her, unable to find a single phrase to bring them closer. He looked at his watch and put his hand back in his pocket. Sarah said nothing else. She wasn't going to beg for his attention or compete with someone else's smiles. She chose silence. In that silence, her wounded dignity found a new strength, one she couldn't yet name. The music played on. The applause continued. The night passed without asking questions. As the festival lights sparkled around her, Sarah silently wondered, what secret was David keeping? A whispered conversation can cut deeper than a shout. Sarah still remembered the coldness in her husband's eyes. The next day, she agreed to go to dinner with him at a well-known restaurant, hoping that a calm conversation would help them reconnect. They chose a secluded table and ordered without haste. Sarah talked about her next doctor's visit, her small morning sickness, and how good short walks felt. David listened with a neutral expression, barely nodding, not offering a single word to bridge the gap between them. When she mentioned the baby's soft kicks, he quickly changed the subject with a trivial comment about work. Sarah understood she was hitting an invisible wall. She decided to remain serene, making the conversation last just long enough to not seem forced, measuring her breathing to avoid a fight. The restaurant buzzed with couples and groups of friends. A young waiter left a basket of bread and some olive oil on the table and wished them a nice evening. Sarah thanked him with a sincere smile. David, in contrast, glanced at his phone before giving the waiter a fleeting look. Sarah tried to keep the dinner cordial. She asked about his plans for next month. She hinted that a simple meal with both of their parents would be nice. She also proposed they visit her brother, Michael, before the month ended. David responded vaguely, saying his schedule was tight and that he couldn't be sure. She nodded without reproach. She focused on eating slowly, listening to the rhythm of the nearby conversations, and organizing her thoughts. Midway through dinner, Chloe Torres appeared, elegant, surrounded by two friends who were laughing easily. They stopped to talk to the maitre d', then headed toward the back of the room. Chloe recognized David and Sarah. Her smile grew a bit wider, and she approached them with a step that was meant to seem casual. "Good evening. What a surprise to see you here," she said, as if it were a coincidence to run into them in a city where everyone eventually crosses paths. David stood up with a bit of a rush and returned her greeting with contained politeness. Sarah observed her without losing her composure. She replied to the greeting with sober politeness and didn't add any questions. Chloe talked about the festival, how alive Boston was, and her busy work schedule. David nodded along, his eyes glued to hers. Sarah internally focused on her breathing, not allowing herself to be dragged into the discomfort. When Chloe went to her table, the tension left an echo that didn't dissipate. David tried to restart their conversation with a superficial comment about the menu. Sarah said she had already decided what she wanted and brought up the baby again. She told him the doctor had recommended rest, avoiding stress, and maintaining a stable routine. David said he understood and ordered another drink. Sarah felt they were speaking parallel languages. She took a small piece of bread, dipped it in oil, and drank some water. She looked around to remind herself that she wasn't alone in the world, that the life of the city continued with its own music and its own essence, that the next day would arrive with its usual light. After a few minutes, Chloe returned. This time she came with a friendly excuse. She said a friend of hers admired David's work and would be thrilled to say hello to him. She called over her friend, who smiled and introduced herself politely. There was a brief exchange. Sarah stayed present, not invading the scene. She didn't want an uncomfortable scene or bad manners. When Chloe said goodbye, she let her hand linger on David's forearm for a few seconds. He didn't pull away. Sarah saw the gesture and decided not to react. She took a breath, smiled discreetly, and said that the food was perfect and that everything was fine. She clung to that simple statement to preserve her night. After the young women walked away, Sarah tried one last time to connect. She suggested that on their way out, they take a short stroll down a quiet street, maybe a 10-minute loop before going home. David said he was tired and preferred to leave as soon as they finished. She replied, "Okay, no problem." She fell silent, and that silence didn't empty her, but rather held her with a serene dignity. She understood that it wasn't the time to argue, that her heart's well-being mattered more than any harsh words. She decided to finish the dinner with composure, but Chloe was not giving up. She approached again, this time alone, with an apologetic smile. She said she had forgotten to ask about a professional matter that interested her and that she wouldn't take more than a minute. David invited her to talk. Sarah took a step back, just enough to respect the privacy of a supposedly work-related conversation. She watched Chloe's lips as she formed quiet sentences. She also watched David's posture, his calculated closeness, an unsettling harmony between them. Dinner continued around them, but for Sarah, the world had shrunk to this small triangle of glances. When Chloe leaned in a little more, the murmur of the room seemed to hide her exact words, but Sarah didn't need to hear them to understand. Chloe whispered in David's ear, "She'll never understand you like I do." The sentence landed with a brutal clarity. Sarah didn't hear the air. She didn't notice the music in the background. She didn't register the clatter of plates. She saw the shape of the words on Chloe's lips and knew there was no benign interpretation possible. It was a precise, cold second. David didn't pull away. He stayed right where he was, as if the phrase had just confirmed a decision he'd made long ago. Sarah felt that her dignity was her only defense. She didn't make a sudden move or try to catch Chloe's eye. She didn't demand a public explanation. She stroked her belly with a small, protective motion and straightened up. She calmly called the waiter and asked for the check. The young man approached quickly. She took out her wallet, paid for her part, and left a decent tip. David left a small, crumpled bill with a distracted gesture. Sarah watched him without saying anything. The contrast was a clear photograph of their priorities. She stood up softly. She looked at David and told him she needed some air. He replied that he would meet her outside. Chloe stepped away with a polite excuse and returned to her table with the quiet satisfaction of a clean hit. Sarah walked toward the exit with a sure step. She didn't need to look back. She knew that any hope for a true conversation had been broken at the deepest level. The Boston night continued, and she, a woman who had always championed calm, chose also to defend herself. At the door, she took 2 slow breaths. She thought of her child. She thought about what she had to protect. She thought about who would listen without judgment, with their heart set on her well-being. The decision formed on its own, a mature, inevitable choice. Sarah rose from the table, tears in her eyes, and decided she would have to talk to someone she trusted soon. The night had fallen over Boston, with a strange silence, interrupted only by the distant echo of fireworks from the festival. Sarah stood in her living room, afraid to sit down. Her body was trembling with exhaustion, but her mind wouldn't let her rest. She knew David would be back, and she also knew that tonight would be different. Ever since she saw Chloe at the restaurant, everything had taken on a sinister tone. Her intuition screamed that something terrible was about to happen. She stroked her belly with both hands and whispered words of calm to her child. She promised to protect him, even if she had to face a hurricane. David entered the apartment after midnight, slamming the door so hard it echoed through the house. The jarring sound made Sarah shiver. He advanced with firm steps, his eyes red, his jaw rigid. Sarah tried to smile, to say good evening, but he didn't even respond. He threw his jacket onto the sofa and looked at her with a maddened gleam in his eyes. "Don't you think I know?" he spat. Sarah's brows furrowed in confusion. David took a step toward her and raised an accusing finger. "You and your brother Michael, always together, always plotting behind my back. You laugh at me in front of everyone. Do you think I'm an idiot?" Sarah took a step back, her heart racing. She shook her head and spoke softly. She told him that she loved him, that the only thing that mattered to her was the baby's well-being. But he wasn't listening. His rage consumed him. The argument turned into a torrent. David accused her of disloyalty, of deceit, of being to blame for everything in his life that was falling apart. Sarah tried to stay calm, but every word she said was returned like a dart. "You've destroyed me," David yelled, hitting the table with such a powerful fist that the wood vibrated. Sarah trembled, desperately clutching her belly. She tried to approach him to stop him, but he shoved her roughly. She almost lost her balance, managing to steady herself on the edge of the sofa. A shiver ran through her body as she saw his dark eyes shining with rage. Then, in a fit of fury, David grabbed a decorative walking stick that was leaning in the corner. He raised it in the air with a blind rage. Sarah lifted her hands, begging him to think of their child. But David, dominated by his anger, brought the stick down on her arm. The blow was dry, brutal. A heart-wrenching scream escaped Sarah's throat. She felt a sharp pain that ran through her body, and she fell to her knees on the floor. She curled up, protecting her belly with all her might, as hot tears streamed down her face. "David, stop! Please!" she begged. But he didn't. He took another step. He raised the stick again and brought it down violently against the back of the sofa, just inches from her head. The crash was terrifying. Sarah closed her eyes, convinced the next blow would land on her. For a moment, silence filled the room. David breathed heavily, sweating, the stick still in his hand. Sarah, her arm throbbing and her heart pounding, looked up. She saw something worse than rage in her husband's eyes. Indifference. There was no compassion, no regret, just an emptiness that left her cold. He murmured in a low, sharp voice, "Chloe was right. You'll never understand me. It'll never be enough." The words fell like knives. Sarah felt the world sink beneath her feet. She understood this wasn't just a mistake of the night. It was a betrayal that had been festering for a long time. The physical blow had hurt, but those words cut her deeper. With tears, Sarah got to her feet as best she could. Her body trembled, but her eyes no longer reflected fear, but a dawning determination. "You have lost me, David," she said in a broken voice. He laughed with disdain, letting the stick fall to the floor. He walked away toward his study and slammed the door shut. Sarah was left alone, with the echo of that laugh seared into her soul. For long minutes, she couldn't move. She stroked her belly over and over, making sure the baby was still there, alive, resisting. She felt relief at a slight movement. Then, sadness transformed into courage. She couldn't allow her son to grow up in that darkness. She had to act. And soon. She slowly got up and walked to the bedroom. She turned on the light and looked in the mirror. She saw her tear-soaked face, her messy hair, her bruised arm. And yet, behind that broken image, she discovered another one. A woman who refused to give up. She remembered her brother Michael's words years ago, when he had consoled her over a minor problem. "Never forget who you are. Our family always gets up, no matter what." That memory gave her strength. She knew in that instant that she had to go to him. Michael would be the only one who could listen to her, protect her, and remind her that she wasn't alone. With trembling hands, she packed a small bag. She put in some documents, a few clothes, and the blue blanket she had bought for the baby. She hid it under the bed, as if keeping that secret were a first step toward freedom. Then she returned to the living room. The stick was still on the floor, a silent witness to the violence. She looked at it with contained rage and decided she would never allow that object to threaten her again. She bent down, picked it up, and carried it to the back door of the house. She left it outside, in the light rain that was beginning to fall. As she closed the door, she felt like she had cast away a piece of her fear. Sarah sat for a moment in the darkness, breathing deeply. The echo of the festival was still in the distance, a cruel reminder that the world was celebrating while her life was falling apart. But between her tears, she smiled bitterly. She knew that this night was not an end. It was the beginning of a fight, and she had already decided her next step. Talk to Michael, tell him everything, expose the lies and the violence, and ask for help. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel shame. She felt courage. She lay down with difficulty, her arms still sore. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to engrave a promise in her mind. She stroked her belly and whispered in a firm voice, "I will never leave you in the hands of his fury. Tomorrow, we will go see your Uncle Michael. We will no longer be alone." The echo of her own voice gave her peace. The decision was made. With a broken heart but a spirit ignited by courage, Sarah understood that the next battle would be harder than all the others. David had crossed a point of no return, and she, with her son in her belly, had sworn she would never be silenced again. The next morning in Boston brought a cold wind that cut through the windows. Sarah had spent the night awake, stroking her belly and replaying what had happened over and over. Every time she remembered the blow, the scream, and David's bitter laugh, a knot formed in her throat. There were no more doubts. She had to talk to Michael before fear became a habit. She dressed calmly, packed a small bag with the essentials, and left the house without waking David, who was still locked in his study. With every step toward the street, she felt she was moving a little further away from the chains that bound her. The city was waking up to its daily rhythm. The murmur of cafes opening early, the aroma of fresh bagels, the voices of passers-by created a backdrop that contrasted with the storm in Sarah's heart. She walked to the train station with determination. She bought a ticket to Chicago, where Michael lived. The journey was long, but Sarah spent it in silence, looking out the window and stroking her belly. In every reflection in the glass, she saw herself more resolved, less willing to give in. She thought about what she would say, how she would tell the truth without hiding anything. For the first time in a long time, she felt free to speak. Michael greeted her at the door of his apartment with a mix of surprise and worry. They hadn't seen each other in weeks, and the expression on Sarah's face spoke for itself. He hugged her tightly, noticing her trembling. "What happened?" he asked in a grave voice. Sarah took a few seconds to answer. She sat on the sofa, took a breath, and began to tell him everything. David's lingering looks at Chloe, the distance at the festival, the arguments, and finally, the brutal assault of the previous night. Her voice broke at several moments, but she didn't stop. Michael listened in silence, his eyes fixed on her, his brows furrowed, and his fists clenched. When Sarah finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Michael took a deep breath and stood up. He paced a few steps, trying to contain his rage. "I can't believe David did this to you," he finally said. "That man doesn't deserve to be called a husband. And Chloe, playing with your pain. I won't let this stand." Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I don't want revenge, Michael. I just want to protect my child and find peace. I can't keep living like this." Michael knelt in front of her, took her hands, and spoke in a firm voice. "You're not alone. I promise you. The family is with you. We're going to find a way out." Michael's promise gave Sarah a flicker of hope. For years, she had been afraid to carry the weight in silence, but now she felt the wall of her solitude crumbling. Michael suggested she stay for a few days, under his protection. Sarah accepted. She knew David wouldn't be immediately suspicious, and that distance would give her time to think about the next steps. They spent the afternoon talking. Michael reminded her of their childhood, their parents' strength, the courage they had always shown in difficult times. Those words were a balm for Sarah, who slowly regained her self-confidence. As night fell, Michael received a call from a colleague who knew David well in the business world. He told him that rumors about him and Chloe were already circulating in the city, that many had seen overly intimate gestures between them. Sarah felt a chill. It wasn't just her perception. David's betrayal was public, and everyone was talking about it. Michael, His face hardened, gritted his teeth. "This won't stand. But first, we'll protect you. Tomorrow, we'll talk to a trusted lawyer. We need to get everything on the record, for you and for the baby." Sarah nodded. She understood that the journey was just beginning, but having a plan gave her room to breathe. Later, while Michael was preparing dinner, Sarah went out to the balcony. She looked at the lights of Chicago and let the cold wind hit her face. She thought about David and how he had changed. She remembered the man who had made her fall in love with him, who had promised her care and tenderness. That man no longer existed. What was left was a stranger capable of raising a stick against her. She felt rage, but also relief that she had taken the step to escape. She stroked her belly again and whispered, "Now we're safe. I promise I'll never expose you to that darkness again." The night went on with long conversations with Michael. They talked about their childhood, their mother's strength, and the times they had overcome adversity together. Sarah listened carefully, feeling that these stories were building a bridge between her past and the future she wanted to create for her son. Michael insisted that what was important was not what she had lost, but what she could still save. Her dignity, her freedom, and the family that would always be on her side. Every word was a solid stone on the new path Sarah was starting to walk. Before she went to sleep, Michael looked at her seriously. "Tomorrow will be a long day. You have to be ready to tell everything clearly. But remember, you are not to blame. You are the victim, and your strength will be your greatest defense." Sarah felt it with tears in her eyes. She lay down on the guest bed and closed her eyes. The pain was still there, but for the first time in a long time, she felt she wasn't alone in the darkness. On the other side of the hallway, her brother was watching over her. That certainty was enough for her to fall into a restless sleep, but one filled with determination. The next dawn would bring new challenges, but Sarah was no longer afraid to face them. She had broken the silence. She had shared the truth with someone who truly loved her. And now, with Michael by her side, she knew the fight for her dignity had just begun. The next morning in Chicago brought an air of nervousness to Michael's house. Sarah had barely slept, but the determination to take the next step kept her going. She had spent the night mentally reviewing every detail of what had happened with David, ready to tell it with precision to whomever she needed to. Michael, always protective, had already contacted a trusted lawyer, a serious and experienced man named Javier Morales, who agreed to see them that very day in his office. The idea of talking to an outsider filled her with fear, but also with relief. It was time to create a record, to bring what had remained in the shadows out into the light. When they arrived at the office, Sarah felt the weight of every step. Javier received them cordially, but he immediately noticed the tension in her face. Michael spoke first and briefly explained the situation. Then, Sarah detailed what her life had been like in recent weeks. The complicit glances between David and Chloe, the cold comments, the lack of support, and finally, the attack with the stick. While she spoke, her voice broke at times, but she didn't stop. Javier listened carefully, taking notes, nodding from time to time. When Sarah finished, a deep silence fell. The lawyer took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "You have a clear case of violence and abuse. What your husband has done cannot go unpunished. You need immediate legal protection." Sarah lowered her gaze, holding back tears. She didn't see herself as a strong person, but hearing that she had a right to defend herself gave her a chance to breathe. Javier explained the legal steps: formally report the assault, request protective measures, and prepare evidence to demonstrate both the violence and the public infidelity. Michael intervened forcefully, saying he was fed up with David's abuse and was willing to testify to whatever was necessary. Sarah, her voice trembling, confessed that what she feared most was that David would use his financial power to silence her. Javier looked her in the eyes and assured her that she would not be alone, that the law still had ways to protect her. After the meeting, Sarah left with the feeling of having taken a giant step. She walked with Michael down the street, her heart beating fast, but feeling lighter. She felt supported and understood. However, she also knew that her decision would have consequences. David would not sit idly by. Michael knew this, and that's why he insisted she remain in his care. Sarah nodded, stroked her belly, and thought of the baby as a source of courage. It wasn't just about her. Every step she took was also for the life growing inside her. That same afternoon, Michael received an unexpected call. It was a business partner who told him that David had appeared in public with Chloe at an event in Boston without hiding the relationship. The news was already circulating in some social circles, and everyone was commenting on the shamelessness of the businessman. Sarah felt a chill. There was no doubt. David had not only betrayed her in private, now he was also humiliating her publicly. Michael hung up with a hardened face. That man has crossed every line. Now the truth will be told. I promise you. Sarah, though hurt, felt that each new humiliation was one more piece of evidence to support her case. That night, while they had dinner together, Michael reminded her again of the importance of staying strong. He told her she couldn't falter, that her dignity and her son's were at stake. Sarah felt it with a determined look in her eyes. She had gone from being a broken woman to a woman who was beginning to stand up for herself. She remembered the fear of the previous night, the pain in her arm, and compared that image to the strength she now felt being with her brother. It was as if she had been reborn in a matter of hours. Before she went to bed, Sarah received a message on her phone. It was from David. His words were cold and calculated. "I know where you are. Don't think you can escape me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but instead of freezing, she immediately went to Michael. She showed him the message, and he, with rage, promised her that the next day they would present it as evidence to the lawyer. This is no longer just a betrayal. It's a direct threat, and he'll pay for it. Sarah hugged her brother and let the tears flow, not from fear, but from liberation. She knew the fight was just beginning, but for the first time she felt ready to face it. That night, Sarah prayed in silence before she fell asleep. She didn't ask for everything to go back to the way it was, because she understood that the past was already gone. Instead, she asked for strength to resist, clarity to make the right decisions, and protection for her son. With a heart still wounded, but stronger than ever, she closed her eyes, knowing that the next dawn would mark a new chapter. She was no longer the woman who was silenced. Now she was a mother willing to do anything for her son, and a sister who had found the strength to fight in her family. As she fell asleep, Sarah understood that the real battle had not yet arrived, but she was determined to fight it, even if it meant facing David face to face and enduring his threats. Because deep down, she knew she had already crossed a point of no return. The next morning dawned gray in Chicago, as if the sky had aligned with the tension Sarah felt in her chest. Michael accompanied her to Javier Morales' office, determined not to leave her alone for a single moment. Sarah had slept little, but the determination to protect her son gave her strength. As they walked down the street, she mentally reviewed the blows, the hurtful words, and the threatening message David had sent her. Everything was painful, but at the same time it transformed into fuel not to give up. Javier received them seriously. "Today we will file the complaint," he said bluntly. Sarah sat down in front of him, took a deep breath, and began to recount what had happened in detail. She explained the scene at the festival, the glances with Chloe, the growing arguments, the violence in the living room, and the stick strike that still hurt her arm. Then she showed him the message David had sent her the night before. Javier took note of everything, reviewed the evidence, and assured her that it was enough to open a case. "We will have to move quickly, because David will try to use his influence. But the clearer we are, the harder it will be for him to manipulate the situation." With Michael's support, Sarah then went to the police station. There, she filed the official complaint. The process was cold, but every word Sarah said was like a weight being lifted from her back. She repeated to the officer the same things she had already told the lawyer. This time, although her voice trembled, she did not look away. She was determined not to be silenced any longer. Michael stood by her side, supporting her with a firm gaze. As they left, Sarah felt that something had changed. The fear was still there, but now it shared space with a sense of recovered dignity. That same afternoon, Javier called them again. He had disturbing news. "David has already found out about the complaint," he explained. "And, as we expected, he's trying to use his contacts to discredit you. He's saying you're making up stories out of jealousy, and that your brother is manipulating you. He's even trying to use Chloe as a witness in his favor." Sarah squeezed her hands tightly. She knew David would not stop. Michael hit the table in anger, promising they wouldn't let him defame her. Javier asked them to be calm and strategic. "The court won't judge rumors. It will judge evidence, and we have the evidence." That night, at Michael's house, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah barely ate anything at dinner. Her mind replayed the image of David raising the stick, the cold smile after the blow, and now, his attempt to present himself as the victim. She felt vulnerable, but also more convinced that she could not take a step back. While she stroked her belly, she thought that her son deserved a strong mother, a mother capable of facing the monster his father had become. In the midst of that silence, Michael reminded her of something important. "Don't forget that you're not alone. I'll be at every hearing, and our parents will support you too if necessary. Blood is thicker than fear." Sarah looked at him with gratitude. She felt that family was the only light in that dark tunnel. She promised not to betray that trust. The next day brought the first surprise. A local reporter called Michael's phone, asking about Sarah. Someone had leaked the complaint. The news was already circulating in certain circles, mixed with rumors about David and Chloe. Sarah felt a chill at the thought of her life being exposed in the media. Javier, upon hearing about it, calmed them down. "This can work in our favor. Public opinion sometimes protects more than the law. Don't be ashamed, Sarah. The truth is your best defense." She understood that the scandal was inevitable. For the first time, she decided not to hide. That afternoon, while resting in Michael's living room, she received another threat from David on her phone. "If you don't withdraw the complaint, you'll regret it." Sarah didn't break down. She walked with a firm step toward her brother and showed him the message. Michael, furious, wanted to respond immediately, but Sarah stopped him. "No, let it be recorded. Every word he says will be one more piece of evidence against him." Michael looked at her in surprise. Sarah was no longer the fearful woman who had shown up at his door. She was a woman who had learned to transform pain into courage. Javier, upon seeing the message, decided to include it in the evidence folder. "This clearly demonstrates his attempt at intimidation. No judge can ignore it." Sarah nodded. Inside, she felt fear. Yes, but at the same time a strength she had never felt before. She had discovered that true courage wasn't about not being afraid, but about acting despite the fear. That night, as she prepared to sleep, Sarah looked at herself in the mirror. She saw the still visible marks on her arm, but she also saw a different fire in her eyes. She remembered every humiliation, every tear, and understood that those memories no longer chained her, but pushed her forward. She stroked her belly and spoke in a low voice. "My son, the worst is over. What's coming will be difficult, but we won't be alone. Your uncle, your family, and I will fight for you. I will never let your father's darkness reach you." When she lay down in bed, for the first time in a long time, she felt that sleep came with a relative peace. The process had just begun. The legal battles would be tough. David's threats would continue. But Sarah had already taken the most important steps: reporting him, confronting him, and not giving in to fear. In the silence of the Chicago night, she understood that the war would not be quick. But she also knew that she had already decided to win it, no matter the cost. The dawn of that day brought with it a strange silence, full of foreboding. Sarah woke up in Michael's apartment with her heart racing. She had slept only a few hours, and yet she knew she would have to muster all the strength she could. That day would be the first preliminary hearing to review her complaint. Javier Morales had already warned her that David would try to discredit her with all the resources at his disposal. Sarah dressed simply, stroked her belly, and repeated in a low voice that she was not alone. Michael, always firm, accompanied her to the door. Before leaving, he told her, "No matter what happens, remember that the truth is your shield." The courthouse in Chicago was full of murmurs when Sarah arrived. Some reporters had shown up, attracted by the rumors circulating about David and Chloe. The cameras tried to capture any gesture from the woman who had dared to file a complaint against an influential businessman. Sarah felt the stares, but she took a deep breath and held her head high. By her side, Michael walked like a guardian, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Javier greeted her at the entrance, quickly reviewed the documents, and whispered for her to speak clearly, without fear, because every word mattered. The room was cold. David was already there, sitting next to his lawyer. He was dressed elegantly, but there was a mix of rage and calculation in his eyes. When he saw Sarah enter, he gave an ironic smile, as if he had already won the battle. Chloe, to everyone's surprise, was sitting behind him, with a look of false serenity. Sarah swallowed hard, but she didn't look away. She sat down in front of the judge, aware that this moment would be a turning point. The judge called the session to order. David's lawyer spoke first, with a confident tone. He painted Sarah as a jealous woman, influenced by her brother, Michael, and claimed that the complaint was nothing more than an attempt to damage the reputation of a successful man. He presented Chloe as a witness, implying she had been harassed by Sarah's hostility. Every word was a stab, but Sarah remained motionless. Inside, she was burning, but on the outside, she projected dignity. Michael clenched his fists, holding himself back from interrupting. When it was her turn, Sarah took a deep breath and stood up. Her voice trembled at first, but soon found its strength. She recounted the facts in detail: the arguments, the glances at the festival, the dinner interrupted by Chloe, the insults, the stick strike on her arm, and the threatening message she still had on her phone. She spoke without embellishment, without shouting, with the serenity of someone who had nothing left to hide. The judge listened carefully, and some people in the room shifted uncomfortably at the rawness of the story. Sarah took out her phone, showed David's message, and handed it over as evidence. The silence in the room was absolute. Chloe was called to testify. With a feigned smile, she tried to support David's version. She said everything was a misunderstanding, that she was just a friend, and that Sarah had reacted with insecurity. But in a moment of carelessness, in answering a question from the judge, she let slip that she had been in frequent contact with David at unusual hours. Sarah's lawyer took advantage of the contradiction and pointed out that this detail confirmed the extramarital relationship. Chloe's face lost its color, and the murmuring in the room grew louder. David, in a fit of rage, stood up and yelled that it was all a farce, that Sarah was destroying him out of spite. The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. Sarah, with held-back tears, looked directly at him and responded calmly, "It's not spite, it's dignity, and it's my son's life that I am protecting." Her words resonated in the room with a power that no argument could match. For a moment, even the reporters stopped writing. The hearing ended with the judge's decision to keep the investigation open and order precautionary measures to protect Sarah. David would not be allowed to approach her until further notice. It was a hard blow for him. As he left the room, his rage was reflected in every gesture. Chloe followed him closely, but even she seemed less confident than at the beginning. Sarah, in contrast, left supported by Michael and Javier, her heart beating fast, but with a new sense of relief. She had spoken, she had been heard, and for the first time, justice seemed to be on her side. Back at the apartment, Michael did not stop congratulating her on her bravery. Javier insisted that this was just the beginning, and that they had to prepare for new legal battles. Sarah, exhausted, collapsed on the sofa. But despite the fatigue, a spark of hope shone in her eyes. She had faced the man who abused her, unmasked him in front of everyone, and survived. That night, Sarah lay in bed and stroked her belly with tenderness. She remembered the words she spoke in front of the judge. "It's my son's life that I am protecting." At that moment, she understood that she wasn't just fighting against David. She was building a different future, a future where violence would have no place. She closed her eyes with tears of gratitude and exhaustion, knowing that there was still a long way to go, but convinced that there was no turning back. The battle had begun, and she had no intention of ever giving up. The morning after the hearing, Sarah got up with a tired body, but a renewed determination. The echo of her words in front of the judge still resonated in her mind. She knew she had taken an important step, but she also sensed that David would not accept defeat easily. While having breakfast with Michael, she received a call from Javier Morales. The lawyer explained that David had been pulling strings in Boston to spread the idea that Sarah was ill, that she suffered from episodes of emotional instability, and that the complaint was a result of her hysteria. Sarah pursed her lips in anger. He had not only hit her, he was now trying to destroy her credibility in front of the world. Michael hit the table with his fist. "That man never gets tired of sinking lower. Sarah, we're not going to let him tarnish your name." She took a deep breath and nodded. She knew it was time to show more strength than ever. Javier proposed that they give a controlled interview to a serious news outlet to expose the truth and neutralize David's campaign. The idea scared Sarah. She didn't want her private life to become a spectacle, but she understood that being silent was giving David control of the narrative. After thinking it over, she accepted. The next afternoon, an experienced reporter met with Sarah and Michael at the apartment. The conversation was intimate. Sarah calmly recounted what had happened: the public humiliation, the stick strike, the threatening text messages. She didn't shout or act melodramatically. She spoke like a mother who only wanted to protect her child. Michael intervened to confirm every detail and vouch for his sister's integrity. The reporter, moved, promised to publish the story with accuracy. When she left, Sarah felt fear, but also relief. She had put the truth in the hands of someone who could spread it. The next day, the article came out. The headlines highlighted Sarah's courage and the complaint against David. The article included excerpts from the threatening messages and Michael's testimony. All of Boston began to whisper. In cafes, in markets, and in parks, people commented on the news. Many expressed indignation. Others, still in disbelief, could not believe that a man so publicly respected was capable of such violence. Opinions were divided, but what Sarah had feared had happened. No one could pretend they didn't know what was going on anymore. David reacted with fury. That same afternoon, he sent his lawyer to demand that Sarah retract her statements. He also appeared on a local radio station saying that his wife was being manipulated by Michael and that he was the real victim. Sarah listened to the recordings with a mix of anger and sadness, but instead of breaking, her determination hardened. "There's no turning back now," Michael told her. "I'm going to confront every lie he tells. I won't let him steal the truth from my son." That night, at the apartment, Sarah received an unexpected visit from her parents. They came concerned, as the whole neighborhood was now talking about the scandal. Her mother hugged her tenderly, crying as she saw her so thin and tense. Her father, a man of few words, looked at her seriously and said, "Daughter, you are doing the right thing. The shame is not yours, it's his." Sarah broke down in tears when she heard those words. For days she had feared that her family would judge her, but instead she found them by her side, giving her strength. That unity restored her lost confidence. In the following days, the pressure increased. David sent people to watch her, trying to intimidate her. Sarah noticed it on the street, in the strange looks, in the footsteps she felt behind her when she went out to buy something. Michael reacted immediately, reporting the surveillance to the police. Javier collected every piece of evidence to reinforce the complaint. Sarah lived with fear, but also with the certainty that every step David took was just digging his own grave. "He's showing everyone who he really is," Michael kept telling her. The tension reached a critical point when David appeared without warning at the courthouse door. The same day, Sarah was scheduled to present new evidence. He tried to approach, yelling that he wanted to talk to her. Security guards stopped him, reminding him of the restraining order. Sarah saw him from a distance, his eyes wide with rage and his voice full of anger. For a moment, she felt her legs weaken, but Michael held her arm, and she regained her balance. Instead of running away, she walked with her head held high toward the entrance, showing that she was not going to give in to fear. Inside, she submitted more evidence. The recent threatening messages, the contradictions in Chloe's statements, and a medical report that confirmed the bruise on her arm. The judge received everything seriously. Sarah left the room exhausted, but sure that her case was gaining strength. Michael smiled at her proudly. "Today you showed that you're not just a victim, you're a fighter." Sarah hugged him, with tears in her eyes. That night, back at home, Sarah reflected on the journey she had taken. She had gone from silence and pain to raising her voice and looking those who doubted her in the eye. There was still a lot to face, but she was no longer the broken woman who was afraid to speak. She was a mother and a sister who had found the most powerful weapon in the truth and in her family. While she stroked her belly, she promised her son that every tear shed would turn into strength, and that together they would get to the end of that storm with their heads held high. The dawn of that day brought an air charged with tension, as if Boston itself knew what was about to happen. Sarah got up early, her stomach whirling, churning with anxiety. That day, the key hearing would take place, where new evidence and witnesses would be presented, and where the judge could decide on final measures against David. Michael was waiting for her in the kitchen with a coffee and a firm look. "Today you are not alone. No matter what happens, I'll be with you," he said. Sarah felt it in silence, stroking her belly, as if seeking strength in the life she carried within. In Javier Morales' office, the lawyer went over the final details. They had managed to get a neighbor to testify, as she had heard screams and blows in David and Sarah's apartment that night. A psychological report would also be presented, which debunked the accusations of instability that David had spread in Boston. Sarah listened carefully, trying to memorize every word so as not to be overcome by fear. Michael did not stop watching her, making sure she didn't waver. Javier concluded with a phrase that gave them hope. "Today, we can change the course of everything." The courtroom was packed. Reporters, onlookers, and acquaintances of the family had gathered. Sarah felt the stares on her skin, but she stood tall. David was already there, sitting with an expression of arrogance, surrounded by lawyers, and with Chloe nearby, although this time she was much more nervous. The tension was palpable. When Sarah sat down, he gave her a look filled with hatred. She held that gaze, remembering everything she had gone through, and decided never to look away again. The session began with the neighbor's testimony. The woman recounted that she had heard Sarah screaming and crying, and then a dry thud. She recognized David's voice insulting and threatening. Her testimony was firm and clear. David's lawyer tried to discredit her by calling her a nosy neighbor, but the woman responded with serenity, exposing the aggressiveness of his strategy. Sarah felt a mix of gratitude and relief as she watched her stand her ground. Michael, from the front row, breathed easier. Then it was the turn of the psychological report. The specialist explained that Sarah did not show signs of emotional instability, but rather symptoms of anxiety derived from the violence she had suffered. His words dismantled the narrative that David had tried to impose in Boston. David lost his composure, mumbling in a rage to his lawyer, which caught the judge's attention. Sarah, inside, felt that the scales were slowly balancing. The most tense moment came when Chloe was called to testify again. At first, she maintained her version of supporting David, but faced with Javier's incisive questions, she began to contradict herself. She stumbled over dates, times, and ended up admitting that she had been in constant contact with David even on the night of the incident. The judge looked at her severely, and some people present began to murmur. Chloe, visibly nervous, lowered her voice and avoided everyone's gaze. David, furious, hit the table and was immediately reprimanded. Sarah was called to give her final words. She stood up slowly, her heart beating fast. Her voice, although full of emotion, came out clearly. "I am not here for revenge. I am here because I want to live in peace, because I want my son to be born into a world where he doesn't have to fear his own father. I am not asking for compassion. I am asking for justice." Her words filled the room with a reverent silence. Many of those present lowered their gaze, moved by the honesty of her statement. Michael, with glistening eyes, felt prouder of his sister than ever before. After hearing all the evidence and testimonies, the judge announced that he would issue stricter measures against David. The restraining order was ratified, and a formal process for domestic violence was opened. David reacted violently, yelling that it was all a conspiracy, that Sarah and Michael had destroyed him with lies. The guards forced him to leave the room while he spewed insults. The scene was chaotic, but in everyone's eyes, it was clear who had lost control. Sarah, upon leaving the courthouse, was surrounded by reporters. This time she did not lower her head. In a firm voice, she declared, "Today, I am not just speaking for myself. I am speaking for all the women who are afraid. You can break the silence. You can find strength in your family." Michael took her arm and guided her toward the car, while Javier answered the legal questions. Sarah felt her heart lighten, although she knew the worst was not yet over. The legal battle would continue, but that day she had won a fundamental part of it: her self-respect and public credibility. Back at the apartment, Sarah collapsed on the sofa. Michael hugged her and told her he was proud. Javier assured her that the case now had solid foundations and that the chances of a final victory were great. Sarah smiled weakly, exhausted, but hopeful. She stroked her belly and whispered, "My son, every day we are closer to freedom." That night she slept deeply, with the certainty that the road was still long, but that she had already crossed the point of no return. She would never again be the same quiet, fearful woman. Now she was someone who had learned to fight for herself and for those she loved. The dawn of the last day of the process came with a heavy air, but Sarah greeted it with serenity. She had spent sleepless nights. She had faced humiliations, threats, and smear campaigns, but now she was one step away from closing a painful chapter. Michael accompanied her for breakfast, looking at her with pride. "Today your future is being written," he said. Sarah nodded and stroked her belly. She felt that she was not only speaking for herself, but also for the life she carried within. Javier arrived shortly after, with a briefcase full of documents. "Everything is ready," he assured her, although there was also tension in his eyes. The courtroom was more crowded than ever. Neighbors, reporters, and onlookers filled the room. The atmosphere was electric. David appeared with his head held high, but his expression showed wounded pride. Chloe was not with him. After the contradictions in the previous chapter, she had disappeared from the scene, leaving David increasingly isolated. Sarah, seeing him enter, did not feel fear. She looked at him calmly, knowing that he no longer had power over her. Michael, by her side, leaned in and whispered, "He is already lost, even if he doesn't know it yet." The hearing began with the review of the final evidence. Javier presented the threatening messages again, the medical and psychological reports, and the witness statements. Everything fit together like a puzzle, revealing David's true face. His lawyer, increasingly nervous, tried to object, but his words lacked strength. The judge listened carefully, taking note of every detail. Sarah, seated, felt that each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall that separated her from her abuser. The most anticipated moment came when the judge asked David to speak. David stood up, his face a mess. At first, he tried to appear calm, saying it was all a conspiracy by Sarah and Michael to destroy his reputation. But soon, his voice rose in tone. He began to yell that Sarah was a liar, that she was crazy, that her child wasn't even his. The entire room held its breath. Sarah remained firm, even though those words cut through her chest like knives. Michael immediately stood up, ready to defend her, but the judge demanded silence. What David didn't understand was that his own outburst was condemning him. The judge, in a severe voice, interrupted. "Mr. David, this court will not tolerate any more insults. The evidence is clear. The violence exerted against Sarah has been demonstrated." The room erupted in murmurs. David tried to interrupt, but the guards stopped him. Sarah felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone with authority was setting a limit. The judge continued. "A final restraining order is issued, and a criminal process is opened with charges of domestic violence and threats." Sarah closed her eyes for an instant. She had dreamed so many times of hearing those words that now they almost seemed unreal. Michael took her hand tightly. Javier smiled discreetly, knowing they had reached a point of no return. David, out of his mind, was escorted out of the room while he shouted insults and promises of revenge. That image, far from scaring Sarah, confirmed that the judge's decision had been just. When they left the courthouse, a crowd was waiting for them. The reporters surrounded Sarah, asking questions. She, in a firm voice, declared, "Today is not just my victory. It's the victory of all the women who are suffering in silence. I want them to know that they are not alone, that they can file a complaint, that they can find support, and that family, true love, will always be stronger than violence. Her words were captured by cameras and microphones and would soon spread throughout the country. Michael, proud, added that family unity had been key to their endurance. The following days were strange. Sarah returned to Boston, but no longer as the fearful woman who had fled, but as someone who had faced her demons. People looked at her with respect. Some approached her to congratulate her, others to ask for advice. She responded with humility, aware that her story could inspire others. Michael accompanied her every step of the way, and her parents, although discreet, offered her all their support. One afternoon, while walking through the park, Sarah stopped to watch the children running among the pigeons. She stroked her belly and smiled. She knew the future would not be easy, that David would still try to find legal loopholes to attack her. But she also knew that she was no longer alone. She had recovered her voice, her dignity, and above all, the certainty that she could build a different life. At that moment, she understood that the true triumph was not David's defeat, but the rebirth of her own strength. The last meeting with Javier and Michael at their usual cafe closed a chapter. The lawyer assured them that the criminal process would continue, but that the protection measures were solid. Michael raised his cup and toasted, "To the end of a dark chapter and the beginning of a new life." Sarah smiled with tears in her eyes. She allowed herself to dream out loud. "I want my son to grow up in a home full of love, not fear. And I know that with you by my side, that will be possible." That night, returning home, Sarah looked at herself in the mirror. She no longer saw the wounded woman, but someone who had survived and who had transformed pain into strength. She hugged Michael and thanked him for not letting go of her hand for a single moment. Afterwards, as she lay down, she whispered a promise to her son. "I will never let darkness touch us again. This is our new life." And with that certainty, she closed her eyes, leaving the past behind to open herself to a future where love and family would be the true victory. In the final moments of this story, when the courtroom fell silent and the echo of the judge's decision still lingered in the air, it was not David's harsh words or the rumors in the press that remained in the memory of those who had followed Sarah's journey. It was the calm with which she left the building, holding her brother's arm. That simple image of a woman who had found her voice after so much pain became the true victory. The faces of those who watched her understood that it had not just been a trial, but a journey of transformation where shame turned into dignity and fear into strength. The most profound lesson this story leaves us with is not only the courage of a woman who faced violence, but the certainty that family can be a refuge capable of sustaining us even in the darkest storms. Sarah would not have been able to take every step without Michael's firm hand or without the silent support of her parents, who finally reminded her that the blood you share weighs more than the hurtful words of a man blinded by power. In that family bond lies the key to rebirth. It is not enough to survive. It is necessary to rebuild with love and with the will not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Because each of us, at some point in life, can fail or be hurt, but the possibility of correcting our course and offering those we love a different home is always open. Time, which never stops, ends up showing that true strength is not in shouting the loudest or accumulating the most wealth, but in learning to ask for forgiveness, in offering a helping hand, and in choosing a new path. This is the silent lesson of this journey. Just like a church bell that marks the hours without the need for loudness, Constant love and sincere loyalty patiently illuminate the grayest days and guide us toward a lasting peace. Redemption and the power of family are not written with grand gestures, but with the persistence of those who do not turn away in difficult times. Perhaps now, upon hearing this story, each of us can look around and recognize in a hug, in a simple gesture, or in a kind word, that same healing power that sustained Sarah. Maybe it's a good time to stop for a moment and remember that the warmth of family and true affection is always closer than we imagine. And if this story has touched your heart, share it as you would share a piece of bread at the table or a memory on a summer afternoon, so that others may also find in it the certainty that, even after the longest night, a new day always dawns. If you were gripped by this story, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more true stories that inspire and give hope. What did you find most shocking about David's behavior? And what moment in Sarah's journey did you find the most courageous? Share your thoughts in the comments below.